Welcome to episode 110 of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm very excited about today's episode on big data, the promise and the perils. I'm a co-PI on a National AI Institute on adult learning and online education, and we spend almost every meeting talking about and thinking about big data because AI and machine learning need really big data in order to be useful. But of course, there are also issues of bias and privacy and security. And if we collect big data that's not representative of the full population, then we're going to be in trouble in terms of the bias that we're building in. So it's a very complicated and interesting topic. And I was reflecting on the fact that education has sort of mishandled how they think about big data, in my opinion. Medicine does a great job because medicine and public health have stressed the benefits and been very careful to reassure people about privacy and security. And so even though medical data about somebody is incredibly sensitive, people have been pretty generous about opening it up, and they see the benefits in terms of fields like epidemiology. Social media has also succeeded in collecting a lot of big data, unfortunately, not by being honest and careful, but by being dishonest and careless, overemphasizing the benefits of sharing your social media data and minimizing or sweeping under the carpet what really happens to your data in terms of privacy and security. So they do okay. But with education, somehow we understate the promise. And I think, at least I believe, we overstate the perils. That what you're sharing via social media and medicine is so much more sensitive than anything that you could be sharing by education. It's odd to find ourselves in kind of a high risk category. So I don't know if our guests would agree with that framing, but I think that it's one place to start in terms of looking at the specific case of big data in education. So I'll ask each of our guests to introduce themselves and talk about some of the things that they're excited about, and we'll go from there into a conversation. So Andrew, will you begin? Andrew is a colleague of mine at HGSE, as is Avriel.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And a provocative opening salvo. My name is Andrew Ho. I'm a professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, again, a colleague of Chris and Avriel's. I'm a psychometrician, and my standard line when I say that I'm a psychometrician is that I know that sounds more like an insult than a job title, but it means that I study educational and psychological measures, in particular tests. And so I've come to big data through my training to think of large numbers of test scores. To be clear, that's not what we're talking about today, right? But I've studied in my time, we have a giant database of 450 million test scores that I and my colleagues have produced and generated over time. And to be clear, again, that's not what we're talking about today. And it might set a useful contrast between these big databases of structured test scores and what Chris is talking about and what we're going to talk about with Avriel and Katina. We often talk about the three V's of variety and velocity those kinds of new data structures that are much quicker and much more variable and much less structured, as Chris is saying, offer a great deal of promise and offer a great deal of peril. Perhaps, again, we might overstate them. So I guess what my framing for what I hope we can talk about, and then I'll pass it to Avriel and Katina for opening remarks, is that I always ask in test scores, what are the three W's? And by the three W's, I mean, who is using which data for what purpose, right? Who's using which data for what purpose, right? And I think in education, we have this idea that maybe it's an instructor using data for a formative good purpose. But what we know is that data travel and purposes shift and drift. And the problem, I think, with big data is that we might intend them for one purpose, and then that purpose shifts and drifts. And it can shift and drift to dangerous places, but perhaps maybe, as Chris is suggesting, our imagination is taking us further than and making us more cautious than we need to be. And that's, I think, what we can discuss in the conversation to come. So I'll pass it to Avriel.
Avriel, are you frozen? Avriel might be frozen. Katina, what if you go next?
Okay, Andrew, great remarks, and Chris, very provocative. Katina Michael from Arizona State University. I have a joint appointment. I'm a professor in the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence, and also in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. And I study emerging technologies and their social implications. So we used to have a theory of learning, and we would apply these theories, we would do regression analysis, we would figure out what worked, and we'd go from there. Now we have all of this incredible new tech available to us, whether they're sensors in the environment or sensors in the person, or on the person, I should say, or behaviors. We are starting to analyze this through something called machine learning. And now we have millions of data points for individuals over their lifetime, even perhaps in some contexts over several years of learning. The question then becomes, what are these learning management systems doing? What are these open learning systems doing? What kind of data are these systems gathering? What's the secondary data use like? Are individuals and those who are learners actually aware that this data is being used in a particular way? Is this data being unsold to third parties? And the list goes on and on of potential implications based on the context and based on these agreements between universities and learners, and of course, platform management owners. So that's a bit of a segue into what I do and why I'm interested in this topic.
So I think Avriel's having computer difficulties, and while we're waiting for her to come back, Curt, I think you had a question.
Yeah, and I can restate it when Avriel steps back in a brief way. But first of all, I want to congratulate all you for your robust and successful careers. And I've been watching you, reading you today in your posts and your videos. Katina, you have a couple of videos posted online. I've been watching intently this afternoon. And you also have an article. All three have articles on the web with the blog post. So please, if you're in the audience today, I know John and Dante are there and Dede are in our audience today. Do take a look at the article. Katina has one, just how much of higher education can be automated, which I think Dede in our studio audience will be fascinating reading, and Dante will as well. Avriel has an article, What All Data Scientists and Business Leaders Need to Know About Data Ethics and AI Bias. And then Chris and Andrew have written an article about big data analysis in higher ed. Again, Dede, you're going to find it interesting, the promises and pitfalls. I'm sure John and Dante and others in our studio audience, others watching later will. My question has to do, and it could be asked in two different ways. You've been very successful and, very quickly within your careers. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about one or two things that happened to you early in your career that, for the sake of people who watch this later, we have a lot of graduate students watching this later who might be looking to you as role models and as someone they might contact in the future. And so I wonder if you could speak to what are one or two things in your career that jump-started you, that you could look back now and say, this enabled me to do more than I could have had this one or two events not happened to me. If I had said no to it, I'd really regret it, because it's that one thing, that initiative, that project, that event, that book. Could you speak to one or two things in your career, or that you can look back at that were really impactful, influential in your successes?
Yeah, Katina, we don't have to stick with the same order every time, so I'm happy to have you start. And when Avriel gets unfrozen, we can definitely loop her back in. So why don't you go ahead?
That's a great question. I think I was pregnant with my third child and got an opportunity to apply for an editor's role, an editor-in-chief role. And I thought it would be impossible, actually, Curt, but that opened up a whole new world. to my academics. And I thank the people around me at the time who supported me in learning about what is editing all about. But I really wanted to say it's impossible. No, I remember breastfeeding the baby while on the interview for this role, and coming up against later, as I found out, some very amazing professors. And I was only a senior lecturer at the time. So I think that was incredible. It meant that I was part of a society and a group of people that were all studying around the same topic, but from very different perspectives and disciplines. And that transdisciplinarity actually exposed me to a great deal. So technology in society is a very broad topic. I was a computing professional. Then I went into the field of computing in academia, but all of a sudden here I was exposed to sociologists, anthropologists, social scientists, psychologists, the list goes on, lawyers. And I ended up then getting a scholarship at my local university where I was teaching to study law of all things. So here I was, computing and then law. What did that have to do with one another? Well, a great deal, as I later found out. So those were the two things, taking on an editor's job. And the second thing was going into a different field, which really exposed me to a great number of perspectives and challenges.
So what you're saying is be bold and be comfortable in what makes you uncomfortable. And that leads to success eventually, and creativity. Andrew, want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually remarkably similar to Katina's story. So again, I'm a psychometrician trained in how to use and again not use educational test scores. And so I was here at Harvard as an assistant professor at the dawn of massive open online courses, otherwise known as MOOCs. And Harvard and MIT launched edX together. And in the lead up to those conversations, our provost Alan Garber convened a few folks who were interested in data, but perhaps from other perspectives, to a sort of roundtable conversation. And I got so frustrated with the conversation and the lack of sort of framing questions that I sent him an email proposing a series of frameworks and questions that he might ask. And then he asked me to chair a committee that put those frameworks into action, and it's called the Harvardx Research Committee. And so I asked my dean at the time, I was like, "This is not what I do. Can I say no?" And she said no. and so it's perhaps not just be bold, but be open to other people encouraging you to be bold, and then be bold. But I haven't regretted that for the reasons that I think Katina mentioned, that it forces you to sort of say, do my frameworks hold up in other disciplines and contexts, and encourages you to sort of refine your frameworks and principles for these new contexts. And all of that research continues to be the highest visibility research that I've done. And so, as well known as I might be in educational testing, if I think about just like how my ideas might have shaped the world in a broader way, it's because I took that risk, or was asked to take that risk, or sent that perhaps ill-advised email in my early career that I think has put me on my current path. So it's what John Crumboltz used to call planned happenstance, right? A little bit of planning, but also a lot of chance, and just being open to those possibilities has benefited me. And I recommend that to other junior scholars in moderation.
Well, that's how I got to know you. You leading that project got you all over the Chronicle of Higher Ed and Inside Higher Ed and wherever else. I'm sure many other media outlets, and I'm sure you were interviewed many times for the newest data, whatever that happened to be at the time. And we'll talk about that. I have a question, I'll follow up later in the show about that. Well, we need to loop Avriel in, and so we had people discuss a little bit about their backgrounds and what they've been up to research-wise and other things. And I asked a question related to what's one or two things that kind of jump-started your career, initiatives or projects and so forth. So you want to add that into the start of your question? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for being patient with my wonky internet connection. So I'm a graduate student, PhD candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I study the effects of algorithmic bias on adolescent identity development. And specifically, I'm interested in recommendation systems. So music recommendation algorithms, video recommendation, social media feeds, all of that good stuff. And I'm looking specifically at racial and gender inequities in the ways that algorithms treat individual users, and also looking at the differences in age and developmental stage and how that plays into algorithmic bias as well. Things that have shaped my very nascent career. I will say I got to give Andrew a shout out because I took a statistics course with him, and it gave me the confidence to go off and do even more exciting big data, data science, computational social science things. And I also, a couple years ago, did a research fellowship at Spotify where we looked at Spotify's recommendation algorithm and how it differentially treats individuals based on their age in regards to recommending artists that are not male artists, so mixed group artists, female artists, because they have a big issue with gender bias in their recommendation algorithm. So being able to work in an industry setting and at a giant tech company and kind of understand how research happens there and try to translate that into an academic context has been really interesting to me.
Yeah, look up her videos and take a look. And those people in our studio audience, just type in her name and then watch her videos. She's got fascinating research that's being conducted. And again, there's an article on ethics and bias that you can read that's in the blog post. So thank you for joining us today. Yong's going to jump in with the next question.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to go back to something very basic, because big data is like the darling of everything. It's like something you have to order in a restaurant. You walk in, oh, I want big data. Okay, with more big data. So I think like Avriel says about, we're talking about bias, we're talking about promise, Peril. I actually would like to ask each one of you to give us a very simple English definition of what does big data do? What can we use it for in education? And in what format, and how it might affect our children, our teachers. So just something really brief, so our audience does not have to go back to Google to for its definition. So I would like this from and one of you. Maybe we can start with Andrew. Andrew, would you want to give us a 5 minutes in 3 minutes in the kind of introduction to what is big data?
Yeah, so I mean, the sort of naive, I think, start of the definition is, again, the sort of 3 V's. It's the volume, variety, velocity. And Chris and I in our article tried to expand that a little bit more to think about purpose, right? Because ultimately, whether data can be used for good, it has to start with for what. And so I think about purpose and then drift, right? Because the purpose often changes over time. So to give one very specific example, so one of the articles that I shared was actually about cheating detection. And initially we were going in to study how people learn. And then we saw these very strange patterns and we used statistical techniques to test convergence between multiple accounts that were clearly sharing answers with each other. Right. So one account would take the data of the answers, and the other account would sort of harvest them, and that was like, so initially we went in saying, let's learn how people learn, and then our purpose shifted. Right, it drifted to being like, hey, wait a second, this is a problem, right? And so this is an example of how, big data, every single click is recorded, every single interaction is recorded, and you can go in with an intention to learn how people learn, and we did, and we wrote a lot about that. But you can also learn a little bit of the sort of dark side, right? About, hey, wait a second, now that we see this, our attention goes here, and our purpose is drift, and it raises ethical questions about what you do with that information. We went in trying to understand how people learn. We found out how people are cheating. What should we then do? Should we rescind their certificates? They never knew that we were looking at their data to look for cheating. So it raises all of these again, promise and peril. Immense opportunity to learn how people learn and to hopefully accelerate that learning with, Avriel was mentioning recommendation systems. Let's recommend them exactly what they need next to learn next, right? And that sounds ideal, but then again, purposes can drift, and they can drift in ways that raise serious ethical, moral questions about what we should do in response to what we learn.
Thanks, Andrew. Avriel, you want to go next since you were mentioned already? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I think about big data, the first thing that comes to mind is just the granularity of information. So, you know, Andrew mentioned the clicks that you have done. I think, you know, it's so different to understand every minute action that an individual takes in comparison to like a survey response or, you know, some kind of other form of measuring some kind of construct. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And then the other thing is just the promise of big data is the ability that techno-optimists will say, the ability to predict things with incredible accuracy. And in many cases, that's true, but oftentimes it doesn't work accurately for everybody. And so that calls into question, like, if it doesn't work well for everybody, then does it actually work well? And in my opinion, that means no, it doesn't. But for many people, working really, really well and being really, really accurate for a large portion of the population, or the more important part of the population, is good enough for folks. So yeah, those are the two things that come to mind for me, are just the granularity, the fine-tunedness of the data, and its then use in predicting with extremely high accuracy.
Thank you, Avriel. But, you know, one thing I'm trying to do in my life is to fight big data. So I do not log in on Google when checking Google News. I do not want my data to adjust, you know, all the interface that presented to me. So I try to make systems not working for me, not working very well, by the way. It looks like big data, you know, is capturing, like Chris said, you know, more about me than I'm willing to. But anyway, so thank you. So Katina, what do you think big data can do and is, and the good and bad of it?
Well, back in 2013, Keith Miller and I wrote an article which has probably been downloaded over 20,000 times. It was on the big data challenges and opportunities. And we described big data as both unstructured and structured data. And provocatively, I'm going to say the majority of our analytics in the future, our learning analytics, will come from unstructured data. Unstructured data such as this video that people are watching, and perhaps an analysis of our eyeball movements, even the way we are smiling perhaps, or our muscles in the lower part of our face are being used, whether we're attentive, whether our eyes are wandering, whether we're daydreaming, whether we are lying, whether we're telling the truth, allegedly, through these particular types of software and machine algorithms. But, you know, it doesn't stretch the mind to think in the future we will have more than just keystroke analysis and video analytics to go on by. We may even have sensors on our bodies or in our bodies, as time will tell us, and we'll see what that will dictate in terms of what is actually occurring in terms of patterns of behavior. And so I go back to Skinner, you know, in the 1960s, who talked about behavioral engineering and the teaching machine, and this idea of now we're coming up to persuasive design. How do we encourage learners to learn? As an associate dean, I was always concerned about the reduction of churn in our engineering faculty. What is causing our students to leave? Is it boring curriculums? Is it something else? How can we get that failure rate to get better? You know, when we've got 30 or 40% failure rates in some of those very complex problem-solving subjects and courses. And so I keep going back to stimulus response theories, whether we're going to provide a stimulus before the reward or after the reward, and gamification, and how does learning happen? Are we going to have machines as our mentors in the future, or are we going to really rely on humans to do that part of the equation? Character building, those things that are not content specific, but perhaps look at the whole person. So that's where my mind wanders, and it has great things related to risk, identifying students early on in their studies, perhaps as at risk. And I find that harmful in some cases because of the language we're using around this, at risk of failing based on sociodemographics, perhaps based on other kinds of demography. But I want us to have a big conversation about where learning analytics is going. So there's promise and there's also peril.
So I want to share with you guys one thing. You may respond, you don't have to. So this was a few years ago in China. A school worked with a technology company, and then they're basically monitoring all students, and they're using big data and to make judgment about if the students are paying attention to the teacher or not. And then they were also analyzing if the teachers attracting enough students kind of attention. So they have the cameras in the whole place, which caused a lot of interesting responses to that. So that is one use of big data. And I have not been able to visit the school, but I read a lot of news. Another piece of information I think is big data is in the US, many school districts are using big data to pre-analyze teacher applications for jobs. So, before, they visit a teacher, they look at your vita and resume, and then they make decisions for who needs to be interviewed as part of the final candidates. So I'm just throwing those out there for Avriel, Katina, Andrew, for you guys to think and respond if possible. And Chris, go ahead.
So in 2019, I co-edited a book on engineering learning, and I wrote the introductory chapter to try to frame the issues. And one part of the chapter was about personalization, that personalization may be the single strongest lever that we have to improve educational outcomes, because the one size fits all is clearly fits some at best and none at worst. And it's just, we have to have data about individuals in order to personalize. But the personalization was not about adaptation only. People often get the two confused, and they think, well, you collect data about a student and then you adapt what they're being exposed to. As I listen to what you're saying, what I'm hearing in part is that if big data is about empowerment of the individual through the data, that's a very different situation than making judgments and constraining options for the individual through using data. And I think that when personalization is really thought of properly, it's about voice and choice and agency. And it goes back to Andrew's who is the data for? If the data is for the person that it's collected from, and it gives them insights into themselves relative to others, then I think it's harder for some of these bad things to happen. The other point that I would make is that I've co-edited a chapter and a scholarly article on AI and bias in education. And so I'm well aware, both of those talk about 5 sources of bias. And I'm sure that that's not the upper limit. It's just the 5 that we could fit into a chapter and an article. But I worry that we're going to scare away the very people that we need to avoid bias, because people who have been marginalized in different ways by society are rightly very wary. And if we start to say, well, if we get your data, these bad people may do this, that, and the other thing, and so those groups opt out from contributing data, then we're guaranteeing bias. So it's sort of like voting, if you will. Voting has become a hazardous activity, at least in the United States, in a very polarized society. But not voting is not the way to get around that problem. So do you see ways in which the field might shift to think more about the empowerment of individuals and less about the empowerment of organizations and people who want to process individuals based on big data?
I can start with that. Yeah, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is, if we're talking about agency and empowerment, especially of young people, that needs to happen with the design of the products that are being used in their educational spaces. So, there is a hypothetical data set that exists or can exist that you and your peers contribute to. And so, and here are some of the ways in which this can be used, and here are some of the opportunities, but some of the potential downfalls. What do you do with this? What do you do with this in a perfect universe? And I like to, I'm hoping to do something similar to that in my own dissertation work of like helping youth understand what this is, and not even helping them understand it, but because they have a really good understanding of actually how algorithms work, and they have their own ways of manipulating the algorithms in their world and making them do what they want them to do, especially when it comes to social media. So yeah, I think with students, and in my case, that is young people, but students obviously can be any age, and having them design the technology, like a public interest technology, if you will, to fit their needs.
You want me to jump in with Dadzi's question? It's back to you, Avriel. Dadzi's asking, he'd really like to appreciate if the panelists can shed light on how big data and thick data can complement each other. And he's also asked us other questions earlier. Let's see if I can call them up here. He says, which data for what purpose? And can the panelists elaborate a bit on the connection between data and good AI? I don't know if anyone wants to grab any piece of any of those three stems, but Avriel, I think they're first go with you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's also part of big data and thick data. If thick data means qualitative data, that's also part of some of the work that I do. Is like, here are, for example, this is how YouTube's algorithm is working, and this is some bias that we identified in this algorithm, and then take that to youth and ask them what they think about this, how they navigate these techno-social systems, or algorithmic systems, and like, to know that an algorithm, for example, is biased is one thing, but to know what human beings do with the knowledge of the biased algorithm and how they navigate those systems, I think is like a much more interesting thing to understand. Again, especially because youth have all kinds of coping strategies for navigating these systems. And so that's one thing that I'm particularly interested in, and how I think big data and being able to audit these algorithmic systems, and then kind of more rich qualitative data can complement one another.
I think John's question, I think Andrew wanted to address that. Where does machine learning fit into this? I guess Avriel's already kind of, and Katina already answered that question, I guess, for us, so maybe we can move on. Does anyone want to address any of these audience questions before we move on?
I should say, Katina, I mean, you mentioned machine learning earlier. I'm happy to have you take a stab.
I've got all these thoughts running through my head, Andrew, all the way back from Yong's very pertinent remark about a case study in China. I also studied that same case study. And not only were they using eye trackers and mood detection and other things in the classroom, so students had to stand up or sit up straight for the whole time looking attentive, but they also opened it up to the external world. So any strangers could actually log in anytime they wanted to the classroom. And when people were actually interviewed about how that felt, one young person said it felt like a jail, of course, anonymous, but this was from a credible source. So it felt like a jail. And I felt, because people were watching from outside my family, particularly, and my family could also log on, I had to do the right thing all the time. So almost like our behavior changes based on the technologies that are being used. And so we can think about a future where we leave our front door, perhaps, and perhaps, on our best, behavior. And not that we shouldn't always be on our best behavior, but the world, is a theater. It becomes total visibility. It's an external theater that we're playing to. And I think we have to be conscious of that from the surveillance perspective. I think, Chris, you also spoke about very important things. I would say when we studied the same thing at my former university, the University of Wollongong in Australia, I was chairing the secondary data use of actually learning analytic systems that we were building. We said no to external retailers. We said no to third parties. We said informed consent had to happen. When? It's really hard to get it. Do you get it at the beginning of one course, several courses from each subject, from each teacher? At the beginning when you enroll in the university, day one, do you really understand as a high school leaver that, what does that mean? That my data is going to travel with me. It's going to be analyzed across courses. And then we start thinking about empowerment. Well, how do we empower? This is a call out, not in a negative way to the learning management platform providers, but let's get participation going. Let's also look at training data sets that don't only exist in universities where there's affordability, where the majority of the demographic actually has the propensity to pay. We're talking about diverse communities and colleges where these, different learning systems are being utilized. So what training data are we relying on? Is it enough to have studies from MIT and Harvard? Absolutely not. Not even enough from ASU. We've got to go beyond that. We've got to look at who is going to university, what courses are being completed, what's needed in society, and then look at those training data sets. And going back to what Avriel was talking about, this notion of participation and empowerment. Empowerment only happens when we involve those communities that have been marginalized. Otherwise, we continue to exacerbate the marginalization.
Yeah, I'll just add to that too, and it sort of circles back to a few probing questions from earlier, right? These predictive algorithms imply an action, right? What do you do with the prediction, right? And there's a very clear sort of branching path between the prediction that we just say, hey, this machine learning algorithm can predict this, right? And an action that we take in the future, or an action that we take from the people we learned the result from immediately, right? And so a lot of these recommendation algorithms make a prediction and have an immediate action on that person. And in the case of like shopping on Amazon, that might be relatively low stakes, but if it involves, for example, triaging someone out of a program, or even suggesting them for intervention, like let's say like I get flagged that someone is below some threshold, how do you know that my action is going to help them and not hurt them? I would take the position that absent extremely strong evidence that I am extremely well trained, that's going to triage and lead to people going out of the system more than doing nothing at all, right? So I think this is very well trod ground, and folks have contributed to this, but we just have to get past this idea that just because I can predict something means that I will be able to improve it thereby, right? And I think the default assumption has to be that you will make things worse, and to Avriel's point and to Katina's point, you will make things more inequitable absent some like massive effort and training to change the structure and system to reduce inequality and improve outcomes overall. So I just think there's a lot of laziness when we think about big data, about like, just because I can predict, therefore I can act in a positive way that reduces inequality. Not to be too negative, and I think we think we should really grapple with what Chris said. But I go back to, again, the 3 Ws. Who is using which data for what purpose? And the problem is that the who is oftentimes these actors with massive amounts of power who are never really giving it back to the people whose lives we want to change, and trying to find a way to circumscribe that power, the who, the actor, the agent, right? And not let it drift back to those actors and agents who already have the power. That's a really difficult design problem, but it's one I think we can sort of set as the goal and work towards. And I think that's the good AI kind of ideal, but it's and we need to just work towards that end.
So Andrew, I was going to I was going to resist myself for asking this question, but what you started, and I got to ask this question. In that Batman movie, Spider-Woman wants to have an end to the past. Remember that? Remember that she said, "I don't want to have the past." Remember that one? So, there's a lot of effort trying to build AI systems or learning system for human beings, precisely to do what you were talking about, right? You say, okay, the Skinner thing that Katina was saying, based on this, you will need this learning. That's what, it's a lot of people are trying to do that. They're trying all kinds of things. I have always I'm not an expert on big data, but I've always resisted that idea. I'm like you, just to say, who are you to determine I might need this? Yes, from data, the pattern might be like that, right? So I'm very worried about educational systems when they have individual record for the child from early on. You apply that predictive power. When you're 3-year-old, you will go this. And I'm thinking about another movie too. I think was the one Ants. One of the movies that when you're born soldier, worker, so we make these predictions. I'm very concerned about that. So I want all of you guys to comment. Is my concern justified in the field, or am I just too crazy to worry too much about this using predictive patterns and other people's data to apply solutions to our children? Go ahead, Andrew.
You can't see, but I'm pointing at Avriel.
Got it. I mean, I don't think your concern, I don't think your concern is unwarranted. I also don't think there's ever going to be a scenario like, I love the movie Ants, by the way. But I don't think that's, oh, I'm froze. Okay, I'm back. But anyway, I think the more concerning thing than somebody pointing a finger and saying, hey, you did this at 3 years old and therefore you deserve to go down this career path, is an accumulation of tiny nudges that silo people or children into narrower and narrower visions for what could be possible for their futures. And so when Andrew was talking about flagging systems in learning management systems, or an instructor being able to say, hey, this person is at risk of dropping out or whatever, the accumulation of all of those different kinds of flagging systems or recommendation systems pointing somebody in a direction that they might not otherwise have taken. And then the question becomes like, how different is that from like a bunch of human beings doing that to a child? Because we do that to our kids all the time. But I think the big difference is this big data piece, which is like, we are aggregating all of the data of all the individuals that we can touch to then make a prediction on this individual child's life or potential outcomes. And I don't know in the real world how big of a difference of that aggregate of big data makes in that individual's life in comparison to just like a handful of adults that they come into contact with. But it is something to keep in mind.
Curt, you had something?
Yeah. Now, keep in mind that I used to be a CPA, and this is not being worn because of that. This is Ukrainian colors, okay? But in my dissertation, back in the late 80s, I studied keystrokes, and we created a keystroke mapping system in WordPerfect. And it was like watching a player piano in an old Western movie just scroll across the screen. But it was really boring. It's almost as boring as being an accountant, okay? So given that this show is Silver Lining for Learning, I wonder if each of you could offer us what's one thing that has you optimistic about this field, whether it's a technology or a way of looking at the data, a new viewpoint, a model or something. What's something that you've been reading about or studying or in the midst of or heard other people at conferences talk about? What's the one thing, if you were to pull out, that's got you optimistic for this field? Katina, I guess Andrew wants you to start.
Yeah, I've detected a pattern, Andrew. Now, it's not a computing pattern, but you always give me the hard questions first. I think that's what over to me, but actually, no, let's gamify this a little bit. I'm going to say there's a lot that we can be hopeful about. And, we have a lot of research being poured into human-robot teaming. There are obviously some things that machines can do that are brilliant and much better than us as human beings. And at the same time, I think we've figured out things like criminality of face. It's just like detect the learner who's going to fail, is bogus, right? So we've figured a few things out by now, that if we rely on our training data sets and historical data, we're going to be in a bother in most systems and most contexts and most application areas. So I want to sort of shout out to people like Nancy Cook at ASU, Luke Tate at ASU, Sydney DeMello at Colorado, who are looking at the tie between humans and machines, this notion of human systems engineering, Erin Chewy at ASU as well, looking at how can we leverage the power, okay, of technology and of machines. Perhaps it is in the context of feedback to students and quick feedback, you know, not waiting 2 weeks for an assignment to be returned. At the same time, it's how do our students harness the power of this technology, e.g. to write better grammatically, to have better stylistic expression, to learn, okay? So I think there's optimism if we just keep it to basics. We don't have to go beyond and say we're going to do eyeball movement tracking for X, Y, Z, or we're going to read your mind and know when it's best for you to learn, or, you know, okay, I get it. You know, the NSF will give us funding for that, but what do we always come back to? We come back to, but really just because we can, it doesn't mean we should. Okay, it's the fundamental, I think, premise that Andrew's been telling us today. But I like what I'm hearing from the team at large today, and I think they're my few points. We can leverage technology for good. We've got to hone in on that which matters and not so much be distracted by the bells and whistles that don't really matter. But let's keep focused.
Yeah, in my dissertation, we are looking at writing as thinking and trying to help students come up with better revisionary tactics. So there was a goal behind the big data that we had, right? And all that. Yeah, Andrew?
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up on that. Again, I keep saying who and, which data for what purposes. And I think as long as we keep the who as like the student, and the teacher and their agency and their choice, right? So that it's not like putting people onto paths without ever giving students a choice, right? Or teachers a choice, right? It's all of it is, if we're not cautious, it can be about stripping away agency. And so what I've, I'm just like Nella Rourke, Victor Lee. I just sort of think about people who are like deliberately putting the data in the hands of people to inform their decisions, right? And so it's not just like the people with the power are putting you on this predetermined path. That as a result of this, AI or prediction or machine learning activity, I feel empowered, right, to make better decisions, right? And so the who becomes the student, and the who becomes the teacher and the student, co-creating something together. That's data for good, in my opinion. And it all starts with the agency, the choice, right? The informed choice and action that the student can decide for themselves, right? That to me is a clear guiding principle.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I gotta say, there's maybe. There's not a whole lot that I'm really hopeful about in this field, just because I spend so much time thinking about how terrible things can go for the most marginalized among us. And even when we have the best intentions, the society is set up in such a way that like people get harmed even when you're trying really hard not to harm them. So it's really tough for me to be optimistic in that sense. But I will say that one thing that I think is really powerful about the ability to make recommendations for youth, for students, that pool together the resources of big data is kind of goes off of what Andrew was saying in terms of showing people that there are other people out there like them. And saying like, so an example of this, I think for me, especially in the realm of social media, is like, I might be a young girl of color with a specific disability in my school, but thanks to an algorithm, I'm actually able to find a community of individuals who have the same life experiences as me, but they just live somewhere else across the world. And so like the idea that computers can learn so much about us and understand so much about us that they can then connect us to other individuals who are having similar life experiences as us, especially when our life experiences can feel very disempowering, is what keeps me hopeful. And I hope that those who are thinking about the use of big data and algorithms, machine learning in educational contexts, keep in mind that we have to make sure that these technologies work well for the most invisible, the most marginalized among us.
I'll jump in on this question as well. I'm optimistic about the emphasis on data science that's emerging, not only at the college level, but at the K-12 level. Because if you don't want to be manipulated, as Avriel and others have said, understanding how the system works is really important. And if I were to name the two most important mathematical types of knowledge that students should have when they graduate from high school, it would be data science and statistics, neither one of which is part of the mathematics curriculum. Incidentally, why we think that the ability to factor is somehow going to be an important asset in adult life is a mystery to me. But if we can get really good data science courses that use real world examples that are of the type that we're discussing here into the curriculum, college and pre-college, and we couple it with really good courses in statistical reasoning, I think that could make a huge difference in terms of an educated population.
You know
So
what?
I just have to give a shout out to this is very rare, so but I will give a shout out to Harvard admissions. So just a couple of weeks ago, you may have seen applicants to Harvard should excel in a challenging high school math sequence corresponding to their educational interests and aspirations. And the ... specifically, calculus is neither a requirement nor a preference for admission to Harvard. They say rigorous and relevant data science, computer science, statistics, mathematical modeling, calculus, and other advanced math classes are given equal consideration in the application process. Good for them.
All right. Well, we won't criticize Harvard for any of its decisions, but we joke about Harvard all the time. So time just flies so fast because this is such a really it's unending topic. So I have another really very quick question for you. When Chris was talking about, actually all of us talk about data science. What should you know? What should you not know? And there are many different ways to approach data, but like Andrew, you are reading. So my actually very basic interest is this. I'm going back to individual learners. Think about learning analytics. Individual learners, you have this kind of basic psychological thing that's called human being, maybe universal. But then the context, I think, Avriel, you appreciate that. This is if you were born like in a Chinese village, like I was born in, the opportunities you have, the people you meet, the daily things you interact with, definitely they're different from Cambridge or actually Phoenix in Arizona. So when you apply like a tool, let's say a learning system tool, many companies are trying to market them, as personalized learning tools. How do you get people to react, to bring their local context to a universal global tool that's invented for others? I know you may not be in the system. You guys may not be making things like that. I'm just thinking about you as an expert. How would you comment on that? It's not a hard question, you guys. Go ahead. Katina or Avriel or Andrew, anyone? Oh, Katina,
well,
go ahead.
I think it goes back to this fundamental precept of who is all this for? If it's for the individual, if it's for the learner, if it's for the person who's being educated so that they can make a contribution to society and have a fulfilling life, then the kinds of tools that are built are going to be very different than tools that are for monetizing venture capital or tools that are for keeping the status quo in power. And so in a sense, there is a strong ethical dimension to big data in education in the same way that there's a strong ethical dimension to every aspect of education, because the stakes are so high in terms of influencing the future of society. So we've got just a little bit of time left. What I'd like to do would be to give each of you a minute to just say whatever you would like to say to people who watch this program in terms of how you would hope that they would think about the decisions that they make about big data as they encounter this in their lives. And then we'll ask Yong to introduce our show 111.
Actually wanted to comment on something Yong had said at the very beginning about wanting to opt out of the system, like not use Google, and how incredibly difficult that is. And so for those of you who are also like, I can't opt out, but I want to opt out, my suggestion is to just like input as much noise as you possibly can. So there are Chrome extensions, there are all kinds of fun little tools that you can do to just like fill your cookies with junk. And that's basically as good as being anonymous. So that's my takeaway for everyone.
There we go again, Andrew. Only kidding. I go back to what Yong just commented on. I think it's a fabulous comment, Yong. Being an associate dean international, where I was overseeing 8 campuses throughout Asia and the Middle East, I really got to see learning in different cultures and different settings. And we're not building learning management systems for everybody. It's more like the Pareto principle, right? You're not going to see these kinds of things being or they've attempted to in even refugee camps. My husband taught in one camp in 2007-8. And of course, the thing was they didn't have internet access and they didn't have electricity most days. So the question then becomes, are we being realistic? Who are we building these systems for? Where is the equity? When we talk about equitable AI, it's not even about dodging the algorithms and algorithmic bias, which is happening, obviously, as we've discussed on this program, but going back to very basic UN SDG goals and looking at different nations and their context. Yong, you're exactly right. What are the opportunities for this kind of data, and how are the systems being applied, if they do exist? Are they being applied in a controlling manner, in a manner that says, I will surveil you for care, or is it really for care? And I want to just shout out also to our academics, actually. Why are we academics? Because we care, right? Because there's a personalized reach to the individual learner. And I'm not saying systems can't be used. I'm the first person to use collaborative tools in my classroom to generate that kind of awareness about the kinds of productivity tools we could use in the workplace and how we could harness them. But I go back to, why are we there in the classroom with our students? And those business models that we need to be very, very, very sensitive about, which talk about, ratios between academics to students, whether machines can be an intervention. Well, let's talk about those socio-technical interventions. What will work when, and when is it for pedagogical reasons, not for reasons of money, as we all pointed to a moment ago.
Yeah, learning theory teaches me that I should just repeat what I've said before, because that's the only way. So I will say, like, again, the 3 W's guides me in both educational testing and big data, right? Who is using which data for what purpose? And then keep in mind that those purposes shift and drift in often very predictable and potentially damaging ways. But to and I guess I would say, look at student and educator agency as a sort of North Star, right? What are the choices that your products or algorithms or learnings are helping them make? But to close with, again, another silver lining, I'd just say, a shout out to the research community. There are ways to anonymize or reduce the likelihood of identification for data in ways that never circle back to the original individuals, and we're learning a ton from those data. And so that's where I think Chris was saying earlier that there are ways in which I can hope that people will continue to opt in when there are those privacy guarantees, so that we can continue to learn how people learn and accelerate learning in the future.
Well, I just want to say how grateful we are to the 3 of you. We know how busy you are. This is a topic that I'm sure puts you in great demand, and we greatly appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you, and hope that it's been a good learning experience for you as well, to interact with each other and us. Yong, do you want to talk about next week?
Yeah, but I got to fill my Google with some big data first, big messy data to mess it up first. Avriel, thanks for the suggestion. And I also really want to acknowledge what Katina was saying. I think eventually, the big data have to deal with human nature as well as culture, the nature of culture, if you want design learning systems. And so I think, and so thank you all of you guys. That was wonderful. And next week, for our next episode, we're really doing something very strange. I was not sure if we want to do this, but then later on I decided we should have an episode. So this is a very new thing. A lot of K-12 schools are beginning to enter into higher education. So many of you might have heard about High-Tech High. Now High-Tech High has a graduate school of education. And it's been running for a while, it's been accredited. There's another one, it's called Bridges Academy for the twice exceptional students. I don't know if you guys know about twice exceptional students. The twice exceptional is basically you are great, talented and gifted, but on the other hand, you maybe belong to special education. So they've been running the school of K-12 for a while in Los Angeles. Then now they have a graduate school to prepare graduate students. So I thought this is a very interesting thing to see how K-12 is expanding into higher education. And of course, higher education has always run K-12 schools for a long time. So next week, we're going to really talk about this to say, what's the new possibilities given all the technological changes, given all COVID? And so I've invited the president of High-Tech High Graduate School and also a student and a school leader from the Bridges Academies for next week. So that's episode 111. Thank you.